Welcome back, Facebook friends. We are discussing Josephus and the Gospels, and particularly what Josephus has to say concerning the predictions that Jesus made at the Mount of Olives, at the what's known as the Olivet Discourse. If you would refer to my first video, Part One, Josephus and the Gospels, the Olivet Discourse, Part One. If you would refer to that Part One video, then you will be able to see the introduction to the lesson. But let's jump back into our presentation here. In Mark chapter 13, verse number 1, as Jesus is leaving the temple, after having severely given the scribes and Pharisees a good tongue lashing, which they deserved, and he pronounced 7 or 8 woes upon them, and also upon the city of Jerusalem, and what he tells them concerning the temple. As a matter of fact, let's take that time to just look and see also what he said at the end of his discussion with the scribes and Pharisees. Look at what he said concerning also the destruction of the temple. In Matthew's account, Matthew chapter 24, and we'll look at Matthew chapter 24, where he finishes up. He says, woe unto verse number 29. We'll start at verse number 29. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you build the tombs of the prophets and garnish the sepulchre of the righteous, and say, if we had been in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets, whereby ye be witnesses unto yourselves that ye are the children of them which killed the prophets. Fill ye up then the measure of your fathers. Ye serpents, ye generation of vipers, how can you escape the damnation of hell? Wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them you shall kill and crucify, and some of them shall you scourge in your synagogues and persecute them from city to city. And then he says this, that upon you, again speaking to them in their day, in that day, the scribes and the Pharisees, the audiences that stood in his presence when he lived upon the earth these many years ago, he said unto them, that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias son of Barachias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar. Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem. So first he pronounces woes and judgment against the Pharisees for their wrongdoings, but then he also turns to the city, to the nation. He says, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you that kill the prophets and stone them which are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathers her chickens under her wings, and you would not. They didn't want Jesus as their savior. Then he says, behold, your house, meaning the temple, Solomon's temple, which later became Herod's temple, your house is left unto you desolate. For I say unto you, you shall not see me henceforth till you shall say, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. And so on the heels of that is when he goes into the Olivet Discourse. And here we're looking at Mark's account. And as he was coming out of the temple, as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples said unto him, Master, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here. Well, let's see what Josephus has to say about that. Also, before we do that, let's look at a couple of other accounts. Let's look at what Luke says. Luke's account goes this way. And as some spake of the temple, how it was adorned with goodly stones and gifts, he said, Jesus said, as for these things which you behold, the days will come in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Then now, let's see what Josephus says about it. And again, you see the references here in Wars of the Jews, chapter 4, paragraph 8, page 1053, and then all of those other references there as we go down your page. When you look those up, those correspond with the slides in their order as we will look at them and see them. Let's see what Josephus says about, because remember Jesus says about these beautiful buildings, these goodly stones. Look at what Josephus says about the beautiful buildings. It says, now, although anyone would justly lament the destruction of such a work as this was, since it was the most admirable of all the works that we have seen or heard of, both for its curious structure and its magnitude, and also for the vast wealth bestowed upon it, as well as for the glorious reputation it had for its holiness. So we see the beauty of the structure, the height of the structure, the wealth of the structure, and also the glorious reputation of holiness that it had among the Romans and other Greeks. He goes on and says, yet might such a one comfort himself with this thought, that it was fate that decreed it so to be, which is inevitable both as to living creatures and as to the works and places also. Another commentary says that the temple was constructed of white marble and the blocks were of prodigious size. This is Adam Clark's description. Josephus tells us that these stones that were used in the construction of this temple some of them were 50 feet long, 24 feet wide, and 16 feet thick. And Josephus is going to confirm this as we read. The next line, the next point we see there, again, are back to the words of Josephus. And this is what he has to say. Again, he's further describing the temple and its beauty. He says, and now Herod, in the 18th year of his reign, and after the acts already mentioned, undertook a very great work, that is, to build of himself the temple of God, and make it larger in compass, and to raise it to a most magnificent altitude, as esteeming it to be the most glorious of all his actions, as it really was, to bring it to perfection. Now the temple was built of stones that were white and strong, and each of their length was 25 cubits. Now we know that, again, a cubit, this is in King James language, a cubit is about 18 inches long. It's about from the distance of your elbow to the tips of your finger. It's about 18 inches long, so about 1.5 feet is a cubit. So he says it's 25 cubits. Each of the stone was 25 cubits. The height was 8, and their breadth was 12. And the whole structure is also the structure of the royal cloister. So he's describing the structure of the temple and the royal cloister. It would be the king's palaces and also the praetorium and all of the judicial structures where the Sanhedrin met. That's what he's talking about, the royal cloisters. One was on each side much lower, but the middle was much higher, till they were visible to those that dwelt in the country for a great many furlongs. So you can see this temple in a great distance, but chiefly to such as lived over against them and those that approached to them. He goes on to say the temple had doors also at the entrance and lintels over them of the same height with the temple itself. They were adorned with embroidered veils with their flowers of purple and pillars interwoven. And over these, but under the crown work, was spread out a golden vine with its branches hanging down from a great height, the largeness and fine workmanship of which was surpassing sight to the spectators, to see what vast materials there were and with what great skill and workmanship was done. Now he describes the surface of the temple. He says, now the outward face of the temple in its front wanted or lacked nothing that was likely to surprise either men's minds or their eyes, for it was covered all over with plates of gold of great weight, and at the first rising of the sun reflected back a very fiery splendor, and made those who forced themselves to look upon it to turn their eyes away, just as they would have done at the sun's own rays. So we can again imagine the beautiful sight of all those gold plates affixed to the temple, and then when the sun rose, it reflected off of that, and you couldn't look directly into it. And he goes on to say, but this temple appeared to strangers when they were coming to it at a distance, like a mountain covered with snow. For as to those parts of it that were not gilt, they were exceeding white. So again, just beautiful, brilliant structure. On its top, it had spikes with sharp points to prevent any pollution of it by birds sitting upon it. And you'll see that. I have a picture. You can make that out. See the pointed structures along the top to prevent birds from sitting on it. And you don't want birds doing what birds do on top of buildings. So that's an artist's rendition, a model of the temple. This, of course, being the most holy place, and then also contained within this structure would be the holy place and the most holy place, where the priests would go in and do their daily duties. And then back further, the most holy place, the high priest would go in once a year on the Day of Atonement. This is the courtyard. And as you enter into this structure, the brass altar where they offered up the sacrifices would be out here. And then the laver where the priests would wash up was about this area before they entered into the enclosed area to do their daily ministration. Then it's another angle model of the temple, beautiful structure. And then that would be a model of all of the cloisters. Here you see the temple mount, and then you see the temple and the courtyard, and then out here are all the cloisters, the royal palaces, the cloisters. And then in verse number 2, going back to Mark, verse number 2, then that's when, after the disciples point out the beauty of the structure, and then, of course, Josephus confirms that when he talks about he was alive before the temple was destroyed, he described to us the beauty of the building. Now, Jesus, remember, he says that not one stone. This is what he answers in verse 2. And Jesus answering said unto him, seest thou these great buildings? There shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Well, let's see what Josephus mentions about that. And of course, when Jesus mentions there shall be not one stone left upon another that shall not be thrown down, well, again, that prompted the question from Peter, James, John, and Andrew, when is this going to happen? And what sign is there going to be that this is going to happen? And then, of course, in their minds, they're certainly thinking, certainly when that happens, it's certain the Lord has to return. So when are you going to come back, Lord? And the end of the age is going to take place. Well, you see here concerning these one stone upon another, what Jesus said. And now we're going to look and see what Josephus, again, follow each of these references in the order of the slides, which we'll see. And you'll find what Josephus says about the one stone upon another. First of all, let's look at these large stones, because Luke's account calls them goodly stones. Matthew's account talks about a large stone. So these are large stones that Jesus was saying was going to be dismantled during this war of the Jews. Let's see what Josephus says about the large stones. The largeness also of the stones was wonderful, for they were not made of common small stones, nor of such large ones only as men could carry, so that they were larger than what an average man could carry. It says, but they were of white marble, cut out of the rock. Each stone was 20 cubits in length, and 10 in breadth, and 5 in depth. They were so exactly united to one another that each tower looked like one entire rock of stone, so growing naturally and afterward cut by the hand of the artificers into their present shape and corners, so little or not at all did their joints or connection appear. So again, this is amazing. These huge stones being put together, placed together without mortar, and they just sat upon each other, and they were so well suited, or as he says, connected together, that you couldn't even see the joints. You couldn't even see their defense. It just looked like one solid stone, all of these large stones together. And he goes on and says, as these towers were themselves on the north side of the wall, the king had a palace inwardly thereto adjoined. So that would be the cloisters, which exceeds all my ability to describe it. So he says it's so beautiful he couldn't even describe it. And obviously sounds like Josephus was a very learned man, very wordy. Didn't seem like he was at a loss for words, but he says that this was so beautiful that he couldn't even describe it. He says, for it was so very curious as to want or lack no cost nor skill in its construction, but was entirely walled about to the height of 30 cubits, and was adorned with towers at equal distances, with large bedchambers. Again, he's describing the cloisters. The king's palace had large bedchambers that would contain beds for 100 guests apiece, in which the variety of the stones is not to be expressed, for a large quantity of those that were rare of that kind was collected together. And so here is an example of those large stones. And you can see how large these stones is. Here's another picture. Well, here, first of all, there's an explanation. These stones are called ashlar stones. And one of the 4 stones that created what was called the master course. The stone that we just saw was 41 feet long. It weighed over 570 to 630 tons, 15 feet wide, 11 and a half feet high, and the largest of some of these stones were 44 feet. Again, there's another picture of these large stones that were fitted to build the temple. There's another example. Here you see how they're laid out. These are highlighted so that you can again get an idea of how this is one stone here. One stone. These are all stacked upon each other. It's how it was constructed. Here's a description. These are not Josephus's words, but here's a description of the stones we just saw. Some of the largest ashlars are found in the southwest corner of the temple mount wall. These stones weigh as much as 80 tons and were about 40 feet long, 8 feet wide, 3.5 feet tall. As seen in this photo, the workers use what is called header and stretcher construction, where the stones are laid west and south in an alternating pattern. Because of the great size of the stones and this style of interlocking construction, all the corners of Herod's temple have been preserved to a great height. And when we talk about the ones that were preserved, Josephus is going to tell us which wall was preserved, and it's going to be interesting. You'll see here in a moment. Going back to Josephus's words now, this is Josephus's words to describe the one stone upon another. He goes on to say, and now the Romans, judging that it was in vain to spare what was round about the holy house, burnt all those places, as also the remains of the cloisters and the gates, 2 excepted, the one on the east side and the other on the south side, both which, however, they burnt afterwards. Now, to give you a little context to this, when it says the Romans burn the palaces. What happened was, and you'll see this in further slides also, that the zealots, Josephus refers to zealots or robbers or tyrants, and they were the Jewish zealots who basically started this whole war. They started this. They seized the temple. They started killing the priests, these zealots, these Jewish zealots, in their zeal, in their dissatisfaction with their situation. They started this war. They killed some of the priests, and they began setting the temple on fire. Initially, Titus wanted to prevent this from happening. And so he wanted to fight against the zealots, and he wanted to capture them and prevent them from destroying their city. But what happened was, when he initially confronted them, he and his men, his army, along with those auxiliaries, the zealots began to fight against Titus and his men. And Titus started losing some of his soldiers. And so things were really, there were commotions, as Jesus talks about. A lot of factions and fighting going on in Jerusalem, started by the zealots, as we're going to see with Josephus. And so they started the fires. Titus goes in to try to stop all of this. His men are getting killed. So he starts to fight back against the zealots. And then, of course, as things progress, then, of course, he saw also that there was no need, and he started setting fire to certain parts of the temple as well. And we're going to look at that. But this is just giving us an idea of what happened when Jesus said, not one stone upon another will be left without standing. So Josephus goes on and explains, he says, they also burnt down the treasury chambers, in which was an immense quantity of money and an immense number of garments and other precious goods there reposited. And to speak all in a few words, there it was that the entire riches of the Jews were heaped up together, while the rich people had there built themselves chambers to contain against such furniture. And now the Romans set fire to the extreme parts of the city and burnt them down and entirely demolished the walls. This is all Josephus. Remember Jesus' prediction that not one stone will be left upon another. Well, this is what Josephus records as the events played themselves out. This is what he saw. He says, now, as soon as the army had no more people to slay or to plunder, because there remained none to be the objects of their fury, for they would not have spared any, had there remained any other work to be done. Caesar, now when he mentions Caesar here, he's referring to Titus. And as you read the entire account of the wars of the Jews, which is a pretty long read, but I read the entire account. And so you'll see over and over, when he mentions Caesar, he's referring to Titus in this setting, and you'll see why as we go on with our other slides. So he says here, Caesar gave, or in other words, Titus gave orders that they should now demolish the entire city and temple, but should leave as many of the towers standing as were of the greatest eminency. That is, Phasaelus, Hippicus, and Marianum, and so much of the wall as enclosed the city on the west side. Now, again, this is very interesting. He left standing the wall that was on the west side. Let's see what else he says about that. This wall was spared, the one on the west side, for a reason, Josephus tells us, in order to afford a camp for such as were to lie in garrison. So for, again, Titus's army, so they can have set up camps there, as were the towers also spared, in order to demonstrate to posterity or future generations. They wanted to demonstrate to future generations what kind of city it was, to show again the beauty and splendor of Jerusalem, and also how well fortified it was. And saw also the fact that the Roman valor subdued that. But for the rest of the wall, it was so thoroughly laid even with the ground. Now, where did we hear that phrase somewhere? Listen to the phrase. Josephus, writing 40 years after Jesus makes the prediction, Josephus says that these buildings, these walls, were so thoroughly laid even with the ground by those that dug it up to the foundation that there was left nothing to make those that came there believe it had ever been inhabited. Now, isn't that interesting? Jesus, again, speaking as a prophet, said that these stones would not be left upon another. And then Jesus mentions that they would be laid even with the ground. And here Josephus writes the very words that these things would be laid even with the ground, and that those that dug it up to the foundation. Therefore, again, fulfilling what Jesus said, not one stone left upon another. Let's see what else Josephus says. I'm sorry, did I skip a slide? Yes. He goes on. Josephus writes, this was the end which Jerusalem came to by the madness of those that were for innovations, again, referring to the zealots, a city otherwise of great magnificence and of mighty fame among all mankind. Now, I find that very interesting that, again, Jesus, being a prophet, made a prediction that the temple would be destroyed and not one stone would be left standing upon another. Then he also made the prediction in Luke's account where he says that they will lay it even with the ground. And here's a man who is not a Christian, he's a Jew, 40 years later, at the fulfillment of these events, and he uses the same words that Jesus used, talking about what the Romans did and thoroughly laid the stones even with the ground. I don't think that's coincidental, brothers and sisters. Let's go on. The next thing. So Jesus mentions that he's starting to answer their question. He tells them that not one stone will be laid upon another. And then, of course, they ask when these things are going to happen and what are going to be some signs. What are going to be some indications to let us know when these things will happen? And the first thing Jesus talks to them about is false Christ and false prophets. Hear what Mark's account says. And Jesus answering them began to say, take heed lest any man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. Then he goes on to the end of the verse 21 through 22. It says, and then if any man shall say to you, lo, here is Christ, or lo, he is there, believe him not. For false Christs and false prophets shall rise, and shall show signs and wonders to seduce, if it were possible, even the elect. So this is Jesus telling them. They said, what are going to be some signs? Well, what were some signs? Jesus says, false Christs or false messiahs and false prophets. I also think it's interesting in verse 21 through 22, when Jesus says, don't believe them. Do not believe them. I mean, Jesus, the entire time he was on this earth, was encouraging faith in him. He encouraged people's faith. He looked for people's faith. Your faith has made you whole. Go and sin no more. All of these things. He was encouraging faith. And the Son of Man comes, shall he find faith? Well, here he's telling them in this situation, he encourages them to doubt. When you see these false prophets and these false Christs, do not believe them. Well, that certainly could be a lesson to us also. I mean, because we obviously have false teachers, false Christs, many people who say things in our day, but we shouldn't believe them. But I'm afraid that too many times the false teachers believe more than the true teacher. Jesus says, don't believe them. Now, having said that, Jesus here is not speaking of the false teachers of our day. He's talking about this is a sign, this is an indication of what would happen when the destruction of the temple took place. There would be false teachers. Now, as you continue to read the Bible, of course, Peter warns of false teachers, and Paul warns of false teachers. And Paul talked to the Ephesian elders in Acts chapter number 20, and he told them, when I leave you, he says, I know that grievous wolves will enter in among you, not sparing the flock. And then he also said, but also from among you shall some of your brothers shall men arise right up out of the church who will take the scriptures and twist the truth so they can get disciples unto themselves rather than make disciples for Jesus. They want to make disciples unto themselves. So Peter, the apostles, Paul, Peter, James, Peter told us just like there were false teachers in the old covenant that there'll be false teachers. So they're telling us about the false teachers that they had to deal with and also we have to deal with. Paul mentions again, there was a time coming when men will not endure sound doctrine, but they will heap unto themselves teachers having itching ears. They are making the prediction of the false prophets who were to come. But Jesus, in this setting, he is giving them a sign that there were going to be false teachers that come prior to and also in concurrence with the temple destruction. And I'm gonna back that up. I'll let you see what Josephus said about that. Because remember, Jesus is speaking as a prophet, and one of the signs that he told them that they could look for, because they asked the question, what are some signs going to be? The first thing he said was false messiahs, false prophets. And then here we go. False Christ, false prophets. You can be found if you look up these passages. And I'll show you what Josephus says about false Christ. Josephus has this to say. Before there was an Egyptian false prophet that did the Jews more mischief than the former, for he was a cheat and pretended to be a prophet also, and got together 30,000 men that were deluded by him. These he led round about from the wilderness to the mount which was called the Mount of Olives, and was ready to break into Jerusalem by force from that place. He goes on to say, and if he could but once conquer the Roman garrison and the people, he intended to domineer over them by the assistance of those guards of his that were to break into the city with him. But Felix prevented his attempt. Now here, what Josephus is doing is he's mentioning a false prophet, again, before 70 AD, but it's leading up to that. And he mentions what Paul, this may be the Egyptian that was mentioned in Acts chapter number 22, I believe it was, where the Jews took Paul and handed him over to custody to the Romans, and the Romans accused Paul. He says, aren't you that Egyptian that led people out into the wilderness? Well, Josephus, again, is probably referring to this guy, because he says Felix prevented his attempt and met him with his Roman soldiers, while all the people assisted him in his attack upon them, insomuch that when it came to a battle, the Egyptian ran away, and a few others, while the greater part of those that were with him were either destroyed or taken alive, but the rest of the multitude were dispersed, every one to their own homes, and there concealed themselves, or certainly they hid themselves. But then look at he's talking about possibly confirming also what was recorded in the book of Acts about this Egyptian false prophet. But remember, even if that's the case, this Egyptian false prophet came after Jesus's predictions here. It comes before 70 AD, but after Jesus's predictions, which would still mean that Jesus was warning them of false Christ and false prophets. But then Josephus goes to write in another account in his War of the Jews. He talks specifically about false prophets during the time of the War of the Jews when Titus came to destroy the temple. Look at what he says. He says, a false prophet was the occasion of these people's destruction, referring to the Jews, who had made a public proclamation in the city that very day. This false prophet made a proclamation in Jerusalem during this wars, during the zealots fighting, when the Romans came to try to stop this fighting. There was a false prophet in the city, and he made a proclamation. What did he say? He made a proclamation that very day that God commanded them to get upon the temple, and that there they should receive miraculous signs of their deliverances. Now, I'm going to let you think about that one for a minute. What do you think is wrong with this saying? Because this false prophet, during the siege, during the war and the commotion with the zealots fighting the Romans and the Romans fighting the zealots and the zealots killing priests and the people, and we're going to see they were doing a lot of other things, there was a false prophet. In the midst of all of that, there was a false prophet who told the people that God commanded them to get to the temple, and that there they should receive miraculous signs of their deliverance. Now that contradicts exactly what Jesus said when he was giving his Olivet Discourse. He told the people, if you're in the city, if you're on the housetop, don't come down into your home. You just get out of the city. And if you're out in the field, do not come back into the city. So he instructed his believers. The believers received that instruction. And so he said, when you see these things happening, you get out of Jerusalem. But here you have a false prophet telling the people, no, God commanded you to get to the temple. Well, that's bad news, because where the temple was, that's where all the action is. That's where all the fighting is going on. People are being slaughtered. It started to be put on fire. And as we go on with our lesson, Josephus is going to talk about, boy, the priests were being killed by the zealots and also by the Romans, and their blood was running in the street, and it was just a mess. You'll see what he has to say. But here, during all of this, Jesus said that there would be false Christs and false prophets. Well, Josephus mentions it, doesn't he? Let's go on. Now he says, now there was then a great number of false prophets. Well, isn't that what Jesus said? That there were going to be false Christ, false prophets. This was a sign of what he was talking about during the destruction. Well, Josephus says that there were many of them. There was a great number of false prophets suborned or hired by these tyrants. Again, the tyrants are referring to, there were three factions in this war. There were three zealots, leaders, John, Simon, and Eleazar were their names. John, Simon, and Eleazar were the zealots. And they were called tyrants. They were called zealots. They're called robbers, sedition, all of those things. Well, what happened is, as the war progressed, Eleazar was finally killed, and his people were dispersed. They were killed by the Romans. And then it was just down to John and Simon. And again, once the city was taken, John and Simon were taken captive by Titus. And of course, they were executed. But that's what it's referring to. The tyrants are John and his leadership, Simon and Eleazar. So he says, these John, Simon, and Eleazar, they hired these false prophets to do what? To impose on the people who denounced this to them, that they should wait for deliverance from God. And this was in order to keep them from deserting. So these false prophets told them, don't leave the city. Now, what did Jesus predict? Jesus says, flee, head to the mountains. But these false teachers are saying, don't leave the city. You need to stay here and wait for deliverance from God. Doesn't that sound familiar in our day also? These false teachers are telling you what God is going to do for them, and God never spoke it. Jeremiah says to some of these prophets, God said, they've spoken, but I didn't send them. Well, obviously, again, God didn't send these prophets. These were false prophets sent there to deceive the people. And he goes on, he says, and this was in order to keep them from deserting, keep the people from deserting, and that they might be buoyed or supported up above fear and care by such hopes. Now, a man that is in adversity does easily comply with such promises. In other words, Josephus is saying, these people were in such distress, they'll listen to anything. They were so desperate, I'll do whatever you say, in other words. Or when such a seducer makes him believe that he shall be delivered from those miseries which oppress him, then it is that the patient is full of hopes of such his deliverance. So again, unfortunately, many of these people listen to these false prophets during the time of the wars of the Jews with the Romans. Unfortunately, they listened to them and it led to the people's destructions, as we're going to see as we go on a little further also. Now let's get to this wars and rumors of wars. Well, let's look at what Mark says. This is verse 7 through 8. It says, "And when you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars, be ye not troubled, for such things must needs be, but the end shall not be yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom." Then let's see what Luke's account says. Jesus says, "But when you shall hear of wars and commotions." Now that word commotion is interesting because, again, Josephus is going to use this very word to talk about the wars and also the commotions. So Jesus said, "When you shall hear of wars and commotions, be not terrified, for these things must first come to pass, but the end is not by and by. Then said he unto them, Nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom." So certainly we look at this, and there have been wars all throughout history. All throughout history. It's the fall of man. There have been fighting, been wars, nations coming against nations. But many times what we do is we try to interpret the Bible subjectively. We interpret it by what we see. We think, "Oh boy, I've never seen so many wars before in my life." We often say that, what's our life? We've been here 50, 60, even if we were here 70 years. We can't measure anything by our perception. So right away, when we see wars that are taking place in our time, and there always will be wars, right away we apply this scripture to what we see going on here. We bypass all the generations of other wars. But Jesus, remember again, being a prophet, he was speaking specifically and directing because they were asking, what are going to be some signs that we can see that this is going to happen? That's why Jesus mentioned wars and then rumors of wars. Let's look and see what Josephus says. Again, you can find this in these following books: The Wars of the Jews, Book 5, Chapter 1, Paragraph 1, page 990, and then the others. Look it up and see what Josephus has to say about the wars that were taking place at that time. These are the words of Josephus. This is how the entire thing got started. He tells us why did this begin? Because Titus was off fighting other wars. And listen to what he says. "When therefore Titus had marched over that desert, which lies between Egypt and Syria, in the manner forementioned, he came to Caesarea, having resolved to set his forces in order at that place before he began the war." So it shows us that Titus was off fighting other wars to conquer Egypt, Syria, Caesarea as he's making his ways around, but he was interrupted. It says, "Nay, indeed, while he was assisting his father," which is Vespasian, "at Alexandria, in settling that government, which had been newly conferred upon them by God." So again, they're just basically saying, Josephus is telling us they had just conquered Alexandria or Egypt. And so they saw it as God giving it to them, or certainly the gods. And while they were trying to settle Alexandria, Egypt, and after defeating them in war, it says this. He goes on to say, "It so happened that the sedition," remember the sedition is referring to the tyrants, the zealots, the rebels, the robbers, as Josephus calls them, John, Simon, and Eleazar. "So it happened that the sedition at Jerusalem was revived and parted into three factions." That's those three factions, John, Simon, and Eleazar. "And that one faction did what? Fought against the other." So here you have Titus fighting wars, and then you have these zealots in Jerusalem fighting each other. It says, "Which partition in such evil cases may be said to be a good thing and the effect of divine justice." He goes on to say, referring to these zealots, now as to the attack the zealots made upon the people." So here he tells us the zealots were fighting against the people in the city, the Jews, the other Jews, their fellow countrymen. It says, "Now as to the attack of the zealots made upon the people, in which I esteem the beginning of the city's destruction, it hath been already explained after an accurate manner, as also whence it arose, and to how great a mischief it was increased. But for the present sedition, one should not mistake it if he called it a sedition begotten by another sedition. Wars, rumors of wars, fightings, commotions. So he calls it a sedition begotten by another sedition, and to be like a wild beast grown mad, which for lack of food from abroad fell now upon eating its own flesh. So they're killing each other, killing themselves. It was a mess. He goes on to say, and now, as the city was engaged in a war on all sides, notice again the war. Jesus said wars, rumors of wars. Josephus is mentioning it. So it's the city was engaged in a war on all sides. That's the zealots fighting each other. It says, from these treacherous crowds of wicked men, the people of the city between them. So here you got the people of Jerusalem are caught in the middle of a civil war between the zealots. He goes on and says, were like a great body torn in pieces. The aged men and the women were in such distress by their eternal calamities that they wished for the Romans. Isn't that something? Here, the sedition and the civil war was so horrible in the city that the elderly men and the women were saying, I wish the Romans would come and deliver us from this madness. It says, and earnestly hope for an external war. So they had an internal war going on. They hoped for an external war to deliver them from the internal war. Again, substantiating what Jesus said, wars, rumors of wars. Then he says, in order to their delivery from their domestical miseries that was being inflicted upon them by John, Simon, and Eleazar and their groups. Josephus goes on to say, the citizens themselves were under a terrible consternation and fear. Keep that in mind also. Didn't Jesus say that men's hearts will fail them for fear and for all the things that were coming upon the earth? So they were under a terrible consternation and fear, nor had they any opportunity of taking counsel and of changing their conduct, nor were there any hopes of coming to an agreement with their enemies, nor could such as had a mind flee away. They wanted to get away, but the guards were set in all places. The guards of the zealots are inside the city, the Romans are outside of the city. Well, this is a mess. He goes on and says, and the heads of the robbers, referring to the zealots, although they were seditious one against another in other respects, yet did they agree in killing those that were for peace with the Romans, or were suspected of an inclination to desert them as their common enemies. So here they were fighting one another, but one thing they had in agreement, they says, if any of the people, the citizens of the city, defected under the Jews, we would kill them. So we see again, this agrees with what Jesus said, wars, rumors of wars. He goes on, Josephus says, they agreed in nothing but this, to kill those that were innocent. The noise also of those that were fighting was incessant, both by day and by night. But the lamentations of those that mourn exceeded the other. So here you have war noises going on, fighting day and night incessantly. Then also you have words of woe and crying and screaming and wailing taking place. Just an absolute tragedy. It says, but the lamentations of those that mourn exceeded the war noise, in other words. Nor was there ever any occasion for them to leave off their lamentations, because their calamities came perpetually one upon another. So here's again a picture of Titus. Titus, his name was Titus Flavius Caesar, Vespasianus Augustus, and there's where he ruled. And he was a Roman emperor after his father Vespasian passed. He ruled from 79 AD to 81. He was again a member of the Flavian dynasty. He succeeded. He was one of the only emperors who succeeded his natural father, biological father, after his death. Prior to becoming emperor, Titus gained renown. This is not Josephus talking here. This is other information concerning Titus. He gained renown as a military commander, serving under his father in Judea during the First Jewish-Roman War. The campaign came to a brief halt with the death of Emperor Nero in 68 AD. launching Vespasian's bid for the imperial power during the years of the 4 emperors. And then, of course, we see this is where Titus was a general during this. Now let's go to the famines. I know that it says earthquakes, but we'll look at famines first, and then we'll look at the earthquakes. Famines, because Jesus, these are signs. Remember, wars, rumors of wars, famines, pestilences, all of these things. These are signs that Jesus is telling them to look for concerning the destruction, because they asked the question. He's answering them. He says, and there shall be famines and troubles. These are the beginnings of sorrow. This is just the beginning of it. Then Luke's account says, and famines and pestilences and fearful sights and great signs shall there be from heaven. So keep that in mind. Not only just the famines, we'll look at the fearful sights and the great signs from heaven. We'll look at that later, but let's look at the famine right now. What Josephus says, these are Jesus's prediction. Let's see what Josephus has to say. Here, I have a Marco Rubio moment. Much better. And this is what Josephus says about the famines. Again, you can look these up. Here's what Josephus says. For God had blinded their minds, again referring to the zealots. They were in such a rage and a fever pitch and such a destructive mode that they were blinded as to what was going on around them. This is what he says. For God had blinded their minds for the transgressions they had been guilty of, nor could they see how much greater forces the Romans had than those that were now expelled, no more than they could discern how a famine was creeping upon them. For hitherto they had fed themselves out of the public miseries. So that's why Josephus refers to them as robbers also, because when they were shut in by the Romans, surrounded, remember Jesus says, when you see the armies surround the city, know that the desolations thereof is at hand. Well, the Romans surrounded the army. No one can get out. No one can get in. So now famine sets in. So then the zealots commence to stealing the people's food inside the city, the citizens, the innocent people. They start stealing their food. And, so they're in such a passion, and their madness is out of control. So it says, no more than they could discern how a famine was creeping upon them. For hitherto they had fed themselves out of the public miseries and drank the blood of the city. I mean, they were just taking people's food and their water supplies and everything that the citizens had. These zealots were taking from them. It says, but now poverty had for a long time seized upon the better part, and a great many had died already for lack of necessities. It was now a miserable case, and a sight that would justly bring tears into our eyes, how men stood as to their food, while the more powerful had more than enough, and the weaker were lamenting for lack of it. But the famine was too hard for all other passions, and it was destructive to nothing so much as to modesty. For what was otherwise worthy of reverence was in this case despised, insomuch that children pulled the very morsels that their fathers were eating out of their very mouths. I think that's pretty graphic. You can see that children reaching into their fathers' mouths, pulling food out because they were in such a famished condition. Then he goes on and says, and what was still more to be pitied, so did the mothers do as to their infants. And when those that were most near dear were perishing under their hands, they were not ashamed to take from them the very last drops that might preserve their lives. So as they lay dying on the ground, the very drops that could give them any kind of life was snatched out of their hands. And while they ate after this manner, yet were they not concealed in so doing. But the seditious, again the zealots, everywhere came upon them immediately and snatched away from them what they had gotten from others. For when they saw any house shut up, when the zealots saw a house that was closed up tight, this was to them a signal that the people inside had gotten some food. So, of course, they were going to go in there and get it. Whereupon they broke open the doors and ran in and took pieces of what they were eating almost up out of their very throats, and this by force. The old men who held their food fast or held tightly onto their food were beaten by the zealots. And if women hid what they had within their hands, their hair was torn for so doing. Nor was there any commiseration. They didn't even have any pity shown to the aged or to the infants. But they lifted up children from the ground as they hung upon the morsels that they had gotten, and shook them down upon the floor. Again, you can see this visual very clearly. Little children clinging to the last food, trying to eat it, and these zealots coming in, grabbing the food, and the little children wouldn't let go, and they would lift the little children off the floor, shake the food out of their hand, and throw the little children to the ground. This is what was going on. It was a horrible scene. Then Josephus goes on, but still they were more barbarously cruel to those that had prevented their coming in, and had actually swallowed down what they were going to seize upon, as if they had been unjustly defrauded of their right. They also invented terrible methods of torment to discover where any food was, and they were these to stop up the passages of the privy parts of the miserable wretches, and to drive sharp stakes up their fundaments. Again, you can see that picture. People were eating food, and these zealots and many of the rebels, and as we're going to see later also, Josephus tells us that these people, these poor innocent Jews, would eat their food, and they would also eat their gold and jewelry to try to escape. And the Arabs and the Syrians would take their spears and try again the private parts, and also cut open their stomachs and all of that to discover this jewelry. Well, this is a similar thing. When people would eat, they would put things up their private parts, slice them open so that they can get to the food. That's how terrible the famine was. And he goes on. It says, and a man was forced to bear what it is terrible even to hear, in order to make him confess that he had but one loaf of bread, or that he might discover a handful of barley meal that was concealed. And this was done when these tormentors were not themselves hungry. So many times the zealots weren't even hungry when they did this. What they were doing is they were preparing for their next meal the next day. He goes on and says, for the thing had been less barbarous, had necessity forced them to it. But this was done to keep their madness in exercise, and as making preparation of provisions for themselves for the following days. These men went also to meet those that had crept out of the city by night, as far as to the Roman guards, to gather some plants and herbs, what grew wild. And when those people thought they had got clear of the enemy, they snatched from them what they had brought with them. So here you had the scene is some of the innocent Jews they're so famished because the famine is set in, it is heavy, and so they escaped. They snuck out by night sometimes and went out just to gather up herbs and vegetables and plants, and near the Roman camp. And they risked their lives to do that. Well, these zealots would watch them as they did this, find out where these plants and herbs were, and as soon as the innocent Jews would gather this, the zealots would come and take it away from them. Again, horrible scene. He goes on. Then did the famine widen its progress, and devoured the people by whole houses and families. The upper rooms were full of women and children that were dying by famine, and the lanes of the city were full of dead bodies of the aged. The children also and the young men wandered about the marketplaces like shadows, all swelled with the famine, and fell down dead, wheresoever their misery seized them. So again, Josephus is given a very accurate description of the famine that Jesus predicted would happen. Jesus, being a prophet, makes the prediction. The prediction comes to pass, thus verifying that Jesus indeed is a prophet, because Moses says, if the thing doesn't come to pass, don't be afraid of that prophet. So this is again the thing when we look at these verses of scripture. I'm not saying that there are no famines today and there's no pestilence today and trouble today. I'm not saying that. But all I'm saying is what we see today is not what Jesus was talking about when he mentions the famines. This is what Jesus was talking about, because again, there was 40 years after he predicted it, these things happened. Why would everything that Jesus is saying here, why would it skip over? Why would it leapfrog all of these events and not be fulfilled another 2,000 years from now? And even, why would that be? Again, that would be reading the Bible in an eisegetic manner. That means imposing on the passage what we think, what our ideals is, rather than drawing what's there. So we see clearly that Jesus makes the prediction comes to pass, and Josephus describes to us these events of that very thing coming to pass. Now we'll stop right there, and again, we want to try to keep our videos just an hour long, and we'll pick up on our next lesson talking about the earthquakes, the earthquake in diverse places, and we'll pick up from there on our next lesson. God bless you. We'll talk to you.